All right, everybody, welcome to my new podcast series about the American media, lovingly called The Enemy of the People. We'll get into that title, why it's called that in just a little bit. First of all, I guess as an introduction, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm doing this. And the first and foremost just is, I know content on this channel is kind of all divided up all over the place. People never really know what they're going to get because some of it is political, some of it is about journalism, some of it is about esports, some of it is about gaming. I just generally talk about the things I want to talk about when I want to talk about them, and I know for a lot of people that can be confusing. You know, I don't labor under any delusions about why sometimes some people will unsubscribe. You know, for example, in the aftermath of the most recent election, I did a lot of election coverage. Some people enjoyed it, some people didn't. Some people probably are bored of politics, especially American politics. I wholeheartedly understand that and respect that. So what I wanted to do was, rather than just be chopping up videos and doing live streams and everything else, I wanted to have one particular place that people can clearly see. Guess what I'm going to be talking about here? It's going to be the media. If you don't want to watch it, you don't have to. And the other thing, of course, is that I realized increasingly my political coverage isn't political at all. I mean, my take on the American political system is pretty straightforward. You have two criminal enterprises, one that cloaks their intentions under the guise of progressivism, and one that cloaks their intentions under the guise of business profiteering and economic propriety. Both of it is a complete lie. It's all about power and just sort of getting what they want. Very often they work in cahoots with each other. It's more just about their outward facing message, because different people have different beliefs, and you know, you're not going to get everybody all of the time. So I don't really have any interest in kind of like espousing what I think are strong political messages, because I expect politicians to be full of shit. Politicians are full of shit. They prove it over and over and over again. They lie consistently to you. Anybody that's kind of like politically active is on a path, I would say, to being very disillusioned and very disappointed and very disaffected at a very early age. That they are going to let you down, your political heroes, somewhere along the line. They're all corrupt. The system is fucked. That being said, the people I do expect to tell the truth are the media. And what I realized increasingly in my coverage of the American political system since 2015 hasn't been about, oh, look at this policy, look at this, you know, some people do that. I don't. What I do is I look at the media and what they're saying and then go, okay, this is what they're saying, this is what actually happened, or this is how they're saying it, this is another way of saying it, do you understand why they're saying it that way? And so I'm trying to cut through spin, essentially, or just straight correct misinformation, because that's what I'm passionate about as a journalist with my record, even if it is in my little field, you know, my little niche. So yeah, I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to have an avenue to talk about that, a vector to talk about that. And also, just as a final point, I think when it comes to Twitch and Twitch streaming and the kind of political landscape for that, I gotta say, I mean, look, I respect the grift, but I think 99% of these guys, they know what they're doing, and this isn't a left thing, it's not a right thing, it's just the grift is this. You think something politically, I will say the words, I will repeat the phrases. All American politics is devolved into like sloganeering. It doesn't really mean anything. You end up with nonsense like, it's defund the police, but we don't really mean defund the police. What we mean is increase social well, don't call it fucking defund the police then, maybe. That's, how about that for an idea? No, yo, some of us do mean defund the... Right, okay, this is fucking stupid. But people don't critically think. People don't want to critically think. In fact, critical thinking is generally unpleasant, isn't it? So what people do is they go to the sources that'll just repeat the fucking say the word, say the line, and then they get a little dopamine hit because somebody on a screen is saying what they believe, and that validates their beliefs, and they'll throw money at people that do this, and it's how you end up with ideologues and demagogues and bullshit artists and grifters. And the Twitch landscape isn't particularly conducive to finding out actually what the fuck is going on. And so I despair a little bit for it. But that is just it. I mean, at the end of the day, as I said, if you're politically active at a young age, especially if you're getting your information from Twitch streamers, you're not going to have a good time. You're going to be very, very disappointed once the LARPing ends and the reality sets in. That's just how it is, unfortunately. This episode is essentially a primer for what the series is going to be about. And, you know, as somebody that's worked very briefly in kind of like mainstream journalism, and there's been, you know, things like I've done political coverage, I've done sports coverage, you know, I've always wanted the best for journalists, especially American journalists that work for these huge entities that have these huge platforms. But what I realized very quickly in 2015 and beyond is actually we are entering into a very dangerous time where getting the truth is not really possible unless you're willing to sift through multiple sources, which we all know most people won't. It's that way by design. And not only that, entities are almost proud of showing you their inherent bias and letting you know the bias exists. And as I said, giving you the same sort of dopamine rush. If you hate Trump, you watch MSNBC, you watch CNN. You know, they're still talking about him now when he isn't even president. And so, and their ratings have took a massive hit. You know, we had the Trump pump, and now we got the Trump dump now that he's out. It's very clear that this is a ratings-driven business rather than a facts-driven business. I know journalism has always had its issues with this. If it bleeds, it leads. But at the end of the day, the principal goal of journalism should be to inform, to tell people what's in the public interest, and to do it as objectively as is humanly possible. And those goals are no longer even being strived for by the mainstream media. I mean, there's a lot of lip service paid to it, but nobody's actually doing it. Now, just as a quick thing, and there's absolutely no need for me to say this, but such are the times, you have to qualify everything you say. Now, I found myself in the unenviable position of having to correct the media in lies they've told about Donald Trump, a man that I ostensibly despise, on the basis that this is a classic example of the billionaire that fails upwards and gets to do whatever they want, no matter how much they fail in business, no matter how much they fail objectively. There's always more money to be loaned, more assets to be sold and leveraged against, and so they get to keep on going and do what they want, and they can eventually get to be president. American democracy has become a plaything for uber wealthy oligarchs, and it's not going to end with Trump. You're going to find, people like Zuckerberg and Bezos are going to be fancy once they stop farting around with space travel. They're going to come back to Earth and want to get into the American presidency. We saw this with Bloomberg, a man who was just willing to throw billions into it for no real reason, with no real chance of ever being president, just to maybe destabilize Trump, because American democracy is now a billionaire's plaything. That should terrify everybody, by the way, whether you're left or right. It doesn't. People don't seem to care. So I don't like defending Trump because Trump is Trump, but I have to defend anybody because the media is meant to be telling the objective truth. It doesn't matter who they lie about. They shouldn't be lying at all. And so when you take that stance, you get labeled a Trump supporter. I've had that loads. Now, think about how ridiculous that is, to label a British citizen who cannot vote in an American election, who lived in America, but even while was over there was on a visa and couldn't vote in an American election. When you label me a Trump supporter, even though I'm not, it's irrelevant anyway. It would be irrelevant if I was. In what way would that support manifest itself? It doesn't. And yet it's become this epithet that gets thrown at you if you sort of apply any form of critical thinking and say, oh, yeah, well, the media lied about him there, or he didn't actually say that. You know, oh, you're a Trump supporter. This means, well, it means what exactly? Fuck all. You know, it doesn't mean anything, does it? It's like you wouldn't call me a Macron supporter because I have no potential ability to influence French politics, the French political landscape. I have no vote. I have no say. No, it's just another, because Americans dominate digital spaces, they think all of their culture and cultural affectations and cultural labels have some sort of profound meaning. Calling somebody who isn't American a Trump supporter is absolutely fucking ridiculous and stupid and meaningless, and it shows just how dumb the discourse has actually become. So anyway, why create this series? Why call it The Enemy of the People? Isn't that a bit edgy, a bit edgelordy? Yeah, probably. Although if it's good enough for a cost that a name is book that, it's good enough for me. That's Jim Acosta, CNN. For me, I think that the reality is this. There is an inherent problem with the American media, and not just the American media, other media outlets that want to pay lip service to the American media, want to talk about the American landscape of things, international news outlets. There's a real problem about how they march in lockstep to tell the same story regardless of facts. And they all quote each other and source each other when in actual fact, the initial source can be incorrect. And we've seen this phenomenon time and time again. And it's a real problem. It's a real problem that American media is now corporate owned, and it's a loss leader, and so it is on a corporate teat. It is a real problem that certain types of stories will no longer be covered and no longer pushed into the mainstream because of those corporate and political interests and political ties, and yet objectively false stories will be pushed front and center, not once, not twice, not on occasion, but as a matter of course. And I've seen the change. You know, 10 years ago, when I was coming up and watching all these media programs, the idea of getting something wrong and having to issue a retraction or having to fire a journalist, it was an anathema, it was abhorrent. It meant your news outlet was sort of, it really took a big reputational hit. This is why Fox News, I mean, apart from the fact that Fox News was created specifically to be the propaganda arm of the Republican Party, the idea was that, you know, there was such a liberal bias, why not get things from the right side of things? And Fox had a number of embarrassing stories, but that didn't stop them getting ratings, and it didn't stop them making money. And the sad reality is the Fox News model works, and now everything is Fox News, even to the point where there are some outlets that have a better pedigree and a better history than Fox are actually worse than Fox in terms of the number of stories they get wrong, the number of factual inaccuracies in their reporting, the number of retractions they have to issue. And I've seen that change, and it's got progressively worse over the last 5 years, and you can quantify it, and we will quantify it here. What I'm going to do in this primer episode, I'm essentially doing 2 primer episodes. The first is to illustrate that the media lied habitually about Donald Trump and did it with a purpose of undermining his presidency and initially to prevent him getting elected, but undermining his presidency. Did it sort of with the supervision and guidance of DNC, that's the Democrat Party operatives, and did it continually and got these stories continually wrong, and there were no reprisals for it. And if I was to list every story, by the way, a mainstream American media outlet got wrong about Donald Trump, this would be like a 4-hour, 5-hour, I don't even know how many hours I would need to do it. I'm going to try and condense it. I want to make this podcast digestible. So I'm going to take 1 year. I'm going to take the first year of the Donald Trump presidency and show you how many stories they get wrong. But just before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about objectivity. Now, I don't want to get into a philosophical debate about journalistic objectivity. Can we truly be objective? I did all that when I was at university. It was boring then. It's certainly boring now, especially when we know objectivity has been curb stomped to death in the street before our eyes, along with nuance and context, other things American media and American social media and American journalists despise. The reality is objectivity is something you should always strive for. And what I mean by that is that if you are presented with a story that is particularly negative about one party, you have to look at yourself. Am I wording this in a way to deliberately make it sound worse because of my own personal biases? Have I done enough reporting on the other side of the argument, because with a little bit of balance or another quote or some context from a source on the other side of the aisle, maybe it doesn't sound as bad? Does the person who's giving me the information, does the source, do they have a particular axe to grind? In which case, does that colour what they're telling me? Could it in fact encourage them to lie or exaggerate? And so what you have to do is, when we talk about objectivity in journalism isn't that you find a way to balance out a negative story so it sort of becomes a net good. I see a lot of people fundamentally misunderstand this. No, not at all. Some stories are just abhorrent stories about abhorrent people. There's no dressing it up, but you have to at least try and get the other side for context, for balance. It's a good idea where possible to reach out to the subject of the story, get their input, let them present their side, let it stand as it is. And it's also a good idea that if you have any inherent biases and you cannot report fairly, to recuse yourself from the story and put it in the hands of someone who can. These things don't happen anymore, and journalists have spent all of the Trump era arguing that actually, no, we shouldn't be objective at all. Now, there are countless think pieces out there by American journalists, all pretty much saying the same thing. Oh, God, if we're objective, the fascists will win. Can you be objective with a candidate like Trump? Can you be objective in journalism? Some go even as far as to say, no, we cannot be objective. We won't be objective. We shouldn't be objective. There was a big push in 2016 to essentially excuse and move away from objective reporting. Trump was so bad, we cannot be objective this time. And obviously, if you have a principle, it's a principle that must be applied under the sternest of tests. If Trump was that test, all the more reason to adhere to the rules. You'd be very skeptical about people who say, we'll break the rules this time because it's a huge threat, but we definitely won't do it again in future, because those people, of course, will do it again in future. Once that line has been stepped over, you can't go back. It always stays stepped over. So we'll start with the New York Times here. This is Trump is testing the norms of objectivity in journalism by Jim Rutenberg. And he said, if you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he will be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? Because if you believe all of those things, you have to throw out the textbook American journalism has been using for the better part of the past half century, if not longer, and approach it in a way you've never approached anything in your career. If you view a Trump presidency as something that's potentially dangerous, then your reporting is going to reflect that. You would move closer than you've ever been to being oppositional. That's uncomfortable and uncharted territory for every mainstream non-opinion journalist I've ever known, and by normal standards, it's untenable. But the question that everyone is grappling with is, do normal standards apply? And if they don't, what should take their place? And so immediately, even in something that is trying to have the illusion of itself being objective, they're giving themselves permission to not be objective, to move away from it. The Intercept said the rise of Trump shows the danger and sham of compelled journalistic neutrality, saying newly created corporate objectivity rules have by design neutered journalism as an adversarial force, which is, again, just a nice way of saying, no, we have to do it this time. We have to break the rules that we're sort of ethically bound to uphold, because if we don't, then Donald Trump will get away with all the bad things he's going to do, as if there was no other way to combat corrupt politicians until this new line that they were saying, no, this time we're gonna do it this way. CNN Business said it was Donald Trump that had changed political journalism rather than the journalists themselves, and pontificated that if the traditional model of he said, she said journalism, in which news reports simply put both sides of a story against one another, was thrown out the window in favor of a more aggressive journalism style that sort of prioritized accuracy over balance. Of course, this completely misrepresents what objectivity means, and deliberately so. They're trying to tell you objectivity is they present two quotes, one is a lie, one is the truth, and journalists elevate them both to the same level. No, of course, that isn't what objectivity in journalism means, and that's not really how journalism has functioned in the past. In fact, it's usually the role of the journalist to cut through it all and say which is true. It always has been. The difference here is they are aggressively going after one side and querying everything they say, not so much the other one. That's why it's imbalanced. They continue, to many journalists, political scientists, and media experts, this was a welcome change. It unburdened the American press from false equivalency and made them more responsible stewards of information. To critics, especially on the right side of the political spectrum, the whole endeavor laid bare the innate biases of a coastal liberal news media. Whatever the interpretation, the change is real and can be seen in front page headlines that identify lies, cable news chyrons that fact check in real time, and the commentary of reporters on television and social media who are more unbridled than ever before in offering their assessments on the state of the presidential race. Also, again, in the New York Times, as Trump berates news media, a new strategy is needed to cover him. And of course, there is no need for a new strategy to cover any political candidate. In fact, the rules of journalism are more than adequate to cover any political candidate in the world at any time. You go there, you gather information, you vigorously check it, and you present it to your audience or readership. That's it. It's all fine. That's all you need to do. But increasingly, there was this sentiment that it was actually going to be journalists that had to be the resistance, the hashtag resistance. One of the biggest grifts of all time, this idea that if it wasn't for brave truth tellers in the media, which elevated American journalists from kind of the, gutter tabloid nonsense that most people recognize them as, peddling in, to now suddenly being hugely important figures, writing in a very dangerous time. Again, Jim Acosta loves talking about this. And also as well, it filtered down to the average person. You're the resistance. If you've got to go out there. Well, how do I resist? Oh, I don't know, tweet a lot and click on CNN articles and subscribe to the Young Turks on YouTube. This isn't political resistance in any real sense. It's like the rise of slacktivism, which of course is a very clever conjoined word for slacker activism. It basically enables you to feel really good, like you're making real political change when you're doing the fucking bare minimum, if anything at all. I'm thinking of the people who, whenever there's a big issue in the news, well, I've changed my avatar on social media. Well, that'll stick it to the man. That'll really show him. So the journalists started pushing this idea of resistance. We're the resistance. We have to resist. It's okay to resist. Resisting's fine, when of course they are meant to be completely neutral arbiters of truth that just tell you what's happening. You can choose to resist if you want upon that point. They should really be precluded from declaring themselves to be the resistance. But no, that's not what happened. And it got quite sad. There's a guy called Jorge Ramos, He's one of the most respected news anchors in America, and he works over at worked over at Univision. And he himself, when interviewed about President Trump and how you would cover him, he said, sometimes I do feel that we are in the resistance, that somehow our real job is to make sure that people know exactly what's happening. Because if they were to listen only to President Trump and to his government, they would be getting a completely distorted image of what's happening in this country. And I think when my kids ask me in 10 or 20 years, hey, Dad, you were a journalist during the Trump era. What did you do? Did you resist? I can safely say that I resisted, that I said no, and that I asked questions. Now, one of the things you're going to notice, by the way, all these journalists that claim to be resisting, their idea of resistance all seems to be no great sacrifice to themselves. In fact, generally what resisting to a journalist is they wait until there's a lot of TV cameras around and they create a fucking scene. And when they get thrown out for essentially breaking press behavioral protocol, actually to the massive disrespect of every other journalist in the room, they get thrown out and they martyr themselves and they say, look at how they're trying to suppress me. And you can see that here. Mr. Ramos did this, and I thought it was pretty embarrassing behavior from such a respected news anchor. Of course, that isn't how it was reported in the media at all. You can see for yourself.
Excuse me, sit down. You weren't called. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. Go ahead. No, you don't. You haven't been called. Go back to Univision. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You cannot deport 11 million people. You cannot build a 1900
Go ahead.
wall. You cannot deny citizenship to children in this
Sit down, please.
Those ideas,
You weren't called.
I'm a reporter and don't touch me, sir. Don't touch me.
Go.
You cannot touch me. I have the right to ask a question.
Now, even though the overwhelming majority of the American media at the time basically went along with this and said, look, this is the new normal, we must get rid of objectivity and essentially make Trump the enemy and do whatever we can to initially stop him getting elected, and then when that failed, to undermine his presidency, potentially have him impeached, removed, and certainly make sure he couldn't get re-elected. That was the goal, and very clear that was the goal. But not every journalist at the time was comfortable with people moving in that direction. There was a journalist at the LA Times called Justin Raimondo, who sadly passed away, and he wrote an incredible op-ed about this called "To Fight Trump, Journalists Have Dispensed with Objectivity." Why are the rules of journalism being rewritten this election year? My local newspaper, the Sonoma County Press Democrat, is so clearly in the tank for Hillary Clinton that I no longer take pleasure in my morning read. Trump's acceptance speech, for example, was covered on the front page with two stories. On the left, a straight, albeit somewhat judgmental account of the speech, and on the right, a fact check that disputed every point made by the GOP nominee. Clinton's speech was covered with three front-page stories, with headlines describing her nomination as historic, inspiring, and trailblazing. A relatively mild fact-checking piece was relegated to the back pages. This transparent bias is a national phenomenon, infecting both print and television media to such an extent that it has become almost impossible to separate coverage of the Trump campaign from attempts to tear it down. The media has long been accused of having a liberal slant, but in this cycle, journalists seem to have cast themselves as defenders of the Republic against what they see as a major threat, and in playing this role, they've lost the ability to assess events rationally. To take a recent example, Trump said at a news conference that he hoped the Russians, who were accused of hacking the Democratic National Committee's computers, would release the 30,000 emails previously erased by Clinton staff. The DNC went ballistic, claiming that Trump had asked the Russians to commit espionage against the United States. And aside from the fact that Trump was obviously joking, Clinton claims those emails, which were on her unauthorized server during her tenure as Secretary of State, were about her yoga lessons and personal notes to her husband. So how would revealing them endanger national security? Yet the media reported this accusation uncritically. A New York Times piece by Maggie Haberman and Ashley Parker, ostensibly reporting Trump's contention that he spoke in jest, nonetheless averred that the Republican nominee basically urged Russia, an adversary, to conduct cyber espionage against the former Secretary of State. Would it be a stretch to conclude from this description that the New York Times is a Trump adversary? And so you can see over time how journalists quickly started to give themselves permission, actually. It wasn't just, oh, should we be a bit less objective, a bit more adversarial? No, it became, we are going to defend the Republic. We must stop Trump at all costs. We are the resistance. I can't look my children in the eye unless I told them I resist. And so that brings us to why this podcast is called Enemy of the People. And it was done very much with Jim Acosta in mind, because when I think about the rot at the heart of American journalism, Jim Acosta's the standout guy. He is the kind of towering vanity, narcissism, and willingness to lie that has just taken over American media. He wrote a book called Enemy of the People, itself based on an out-of-context misquotation of something Donald Trump said. And the tagline is, a dangerous time to tell the truth in America. This is another fantasy that American journalists have, that somehow reporting about Donald Trump and the Republican Party is the equivalent to war reporting or doing crime reporting. About the Mexican cartels or whatever it is. And of course it isn't. They sit there, they have a latte brought to them by an intern. They get fluffed by the networks that pay them an exorbitant salary. They're in no physical danger whatsoever. Meanwhile, at the time of recording this, a Dutch journalist who reported on crime syndicates was just shot in the head in broad daylight. So this is another fantasy, and you can see the fantasy. I wouldn't recommend buying his book, but if you do want to have a laugh, certainly go and read some of the free chapters or whatever, because Jim Acosta's grasp of reality is unbelievably slack, let's say. Jim Acosta never wanted to be the story, says the blurb. A veteran reporter, long known for asking tough, blunt questions, Acosta had survived the gauntlet of covering Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, thinking he'd seen it all. But as Trump prepared to take the oath of office, Acosta landed in unexpected territory. Suddenly, unwilling to tolerate Trump's relentless attacks on the press, as well as on his employer, CNN, he inadvertently found himself at the center of Trump's war on the media. What began in the weeks immediately before and after Trump took office escalated dramatically throughout Trump's first 2 years as the consequences of confronting the Trump administration and the personal dangers for journalists who dared to challenge the administration grew more extreme every day. And I think what's brilliant is that Acosta even called his book Enemy of the People because it's an out-of-context piece of a Donald Trump quote for which, as almost every Donald Trump quote, he is being misquoted and misconstrued intentionally. Donald Trump once described that fake news media was the enemy of the people. And this is routinely reported as him saying the media is the enemy of the people. Now, of course, a truth-telling journalistic entity can never be the enemy of the people. Journalists that tell the truth serve the people. But how could fake news be anything other than an enemy of the people? How can huge corporate-owned media entities peddling lies to a worldwide audience, which are lies designed to influence their behavior, be some sort of net positive for the people it impacts upon? There are no oversights in journalism, it seems. You can be caught lying repeatedly. Your colleagues will all defend you. Your companies you work for will defend you. If they reluctantly have to fire you, there's another corporation around the corner that's going to pick you up. Sometimes you can just go away for a few months. You can even jerk off in front of a female staff member during a Zoom meeting and they just welcome you back after a brief hiatus. So the fact they are so determined to look after their own, no matter the transgressions they make. It makes it clear they do not see themselves the same as you, and therefore will not act with your interests in mind. So for me, when I think of a media that lies very often to serve a corporate or political master, yes, I do think they are the enemy of the people. Now, politicians can certainly be the enemy of a free press, but right now, what you have in America is the kind of thing that would be derided and mocked in other countries, when the majority of media outlets work in tandem with a political entity for the purposes of messaging to the general populace. This is the type of thing that happens in, banana republics. This is the type of thing that happens in these dictatorships that we all are super snide about. This is the type of thing that happens in China. America's not a million miles from that at the moment, and that should worry people. We're going to get into some more examples, but anyway, Acosta, you have to understand, why did he go down that road of trying to make it sound dangerous, dangerous, dangerous? Remember, this is a sort of bloated middle-aged man that sits around sipping coffee and then gets up and acts like an insufferable prat in front of all of the press corps, who you can see are seething with how much they detest him doing it time and time again. He was doing it to essentially be able to write this book and market this book. It was a very clear ploy right from the get-go. But he actually pretended, if you remember, that him having a press pass revoked for wrestling with a female staffer as she tried to keep hold of a microphone, he had to pretend that this was fascism, that this was the murdering of the free press before your eyes. And what's crazy is Jim Acosta, like a lot of the cowardly US journalists, are perfectly comfortable with what was done to the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange. Julian Assange, of course, has suffered in a way few journalists have for what he did with WikiLeaks. And it's the American government that are leading to that suffering and enhancing that suffering. And the American journalists that supposedly are all for the free press and, wouldn't want the government suppressing their message, they're the cheerleaders for this. Now, he was actually quoted. Someone interviewed Jim Acosta about Julian Assange, and I'll just read you some of the quotes. Keep in mind, his histrionics after he had a press pass revoked. Julian Assange imprisoned. We don't know when he's going to see trial, in terrible mental and physical health. My understanding about the Julian Assange situation is that he's being charged not just for trying to speak truth to power and trying to reveal things. And what we've seen during the 2016 campaign, where there were contacts between WikiLeaks and Russian operatives. That, I think, takes WikiLeaks and Julian Assange into sort of a different territory than is a straight news organization, straight publisher of news around the world. And when directly asked, should journalists be put in prison for publishing classified information, he said, I'd have to think about that. He wouldn't give a definitive answer. This guy who's talking about how it's a dangerous time to tell the truth. This guy who's made himself the patron saint of journalistic freedom. What's interesting is 17 of the 18 charges that are against Assange are for just what would constitute essential journalistic activities, obtaining and publishing government secrets. WikiLeaks, of course, has a perfect record of publishing straight news. It's never published false material in its entire history. And WikiLeaks, unlike Jim Acosta, has won many awards, which include the Economist New Media Award, the Amnesty New Media Award, Time Magazine Person of the Year and People's Choice, the Sam Adams Award for Integrity, the National Union of Journalists Journalist of the Year Award, the Sydney Peace Foundation Gold Medal, the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, and on and on and on and on it goes. It's also had nominations for the UN Mandela Prize and nominations in 6 consecutive years between 2010 and 2015 for the Nobel Peace Prize itself. So Why would Jim Acosta, patron saint of the journalists and press freedom, why would he not want to stick up for Julian Assange? Well, we're going to get into it. I'll refer you back to that Justin Raimondo article where he said these are the problems we have with the media essentially acting as DNC operatives. And he talked about the WikiLeaks emails and why everyone in the US media hates Julian Assange and doesn't want him to be considered a journalist, despite him breaking much bigger stories than anything they're ever going to touch. The DNC emails he wrote, published by WikiLeaks, reveal a stunning level of collaboration between important media outlets and the Democrats. Former DNC chairwoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz sought to silence NBC's Mika Brzezinski, who had found fault with the DNC's role in the primaries. The emails, having headings like, "This must stop." Incredibly, NBC's Chuck Todd agreed to act as a go-between, even arranging a call between Wasserman Schultz and Brzezinski, which raises the question, why was a major media figure taking his marching orders from the Democratic Party chair, and how did this affect his network's coverage of the Trump campaign? The DNC emails also show that Politico reporter Kenneth Vogel sent his copy of a story for Clinton's fundraising operation to the DNC's national press secretary, Mark Paustenbach, prior to publication. Politico has since apologized, but Vogel has his public defenders. The Washington Post's Eric Wampel said Vogel's pre-publication generosity was meant to give the people you're writing about the opportunity to rebut all relevant claims in a story. One wonders if the Washington Post does this for the Trump campaign. Somehow, I doubt it. And so hopefully that puts you in the right place you need to be when we start looking at these stories and how they just all seem to go one particular way, didn't they? And let's understand that I have nothing against an outlet getting a story wrong on occasion, a journalist getting a story wrong on occasion. Not everybody can have a 100% accuracy record. Sometimes you are going to get it wrong. It's essential you apologize, learn from it, and hold yourself to higher standards. If someone habitually gets it wrong, they're either incompetent or fantasists, and they have no place as a journalist, and they should be fired. Unfortunately, in American news media, that doesn't happen, and we're going to see that now, because we're going to cover that first crucial year of the presidency, and we're going to go through in chronological order the major stories they got wrong, sometimes with very clear and obvious malevolent intent. And you have to ask yourself, how is it possible that the same journalists and the same outlets got these stories wrong the same way against one candidate to benefit another party and with one central message, Trump bad, Trump racist? How did these mistakes, Trump Russian agent, how did these things keep happening over and over and over again? Know why. It was not coincidental mistakes. These were a deliberate attempt, and some of these things we're still feeling the effects of them now. These were not throwaway, just whoopsie, made an error, did a bad quote here, did this, did that. These were really, really damaging to the fabric of American journalism, American democracy, and the journalists obviously don't care, and there have been no consequences for these. Little to no. Some people did lose their jobs, as you'll see. Let's start. January 20th. So Zeke Miller of Time magazine did a tweet saying President Trump, when he came into the White House, he removed the bust, a little statue of Martin Luther King Jr. from the Oval Office. Now, why would you say that? Right? Well, obviously, Donald Trump, white supremacist, Martin Luther King, civil rights legend, an icon, hugely inspirational figure. The idea, the image of Donald Trump taking a statue of him and just discarding it, it plays to that outrageous race baiting that the media engaged in repeatedly. And of course, it was a complete lie. And Zeke Miller put out a tweet going, correction, yeah, the bust is still there in the Oval Office. It was just obscured by an agent and door. So in other words, he didn't even wait, this reporter, didn't even wait to see if, maybe the agent will move or maybe the door will move. He just went with the idea that Donald Trump took a statue of Martin Luther King and threw it in the fucking trash. That was his initial thought process. And certainly it can't be irresponsible, and there'll be no repercussions for this if I just idly tweet this out, which is what he did. Time magazine followed this up basically with a sort of apology, but also kind of an excuse, saying that, yep, Zeke Miller actually hadn't done anything wrong. They said, yep, Zeke Miller incorrectly reported that the bust of Martin Luther King Jr. had been removed from the Oval Office, but he did quickly issue a correction. And in the hours that followed, he sent multiple emails and tweets taking responsibility for his mistake. He apologized in person, on email, and on Twitter. And during further conversations over the weekend, he asked a White House advisor to pass along his apology to the president as well. The president and the White House aides have cited this mistake as an example of deliberate false reporting, but it was no such thing. So Nancy Gibbs at Time writing this apology, they even know the mind of their reporter Zeke Miller. They know that this wasn't deliberate, even though, incredibly, it just happens to play to all the things the media were saying about Donald Trump anyway. And they say, we regret the error occurred, but we believe it's important to share some detail about how it happened. Well, how did it happen? Zeke was in the Oval Office on Friday night as part of the press pool on hand to document one of President Trump's first official acts. He wrote a brief report naming the aides who were there and noting that a bust of Winston Churchill was present in a new spot. Asked by other reporters about the bust of Martin Luther King Jr., Zeke said he'd looked for it and not seen it. Oh my God, where could it be? As a result, a pool report by another reporter sent out at 7:31 p.m., based partly on Zeke's observation, said more decorating details. Apart from the return of the Churchill bust, the MLK bust was no longer on display. So in other words, yeah, just throwing around these baseless accusations based on absolutely nothing and limited information. It wasn't really their fault that another journalist ran with it and that Zeke Miller then later tweeted it out. No, in fact, guys, this is just the new normal. Mistakes will happen. It certainly wasn't deliberate. January 26th, Josh Rogan of the Washington Post reported that the State Department's entire senior administrative team had resigned to protest Donald Trump coming in. This was picked up by a number of media outlets that ranged from left to right, but it was down to the very left-leaning Vox to go into details as to why this claim was misleading in some areas and just flat out wrong in others. Vox said in their report, the entire senior level of management officials resigned Wednesday, part of an ongoing mass exodus of senior foreign service officers who don't want to stick around for the Trump era, said Josh Rogan. There was certainly an element of truth to this. Kennedy and those three deputies had indeed left the department, and the story went viral almost immediately. According to Ishan Tharoor, a foreign affairs writer for the Post, the story was breaking Chartbeat, which is a tool used by news websites to take stock of traffic. I've never seen anything like it. But as the day went on, key elements of the article came into question. For one, the initial headline was misleading. The word management strongly implies that all of America's top diplomats were resigning, which was not the case. And for another, Kennedy's entire team hadn't left when the story was posted. A point that became abundantly clear after simply taking a look at the state's organizational chart, something, of course, the original reporter didn't think to do. Critics inside and outside of the State Department also pushed back hard against the story's most explosive suggestion that it was part of a mass exodus of people who were all opposed to Donald Trump. The State Department said that the four officials had submitted their resignations at the start of the new administration, as is standard practice with all political appointees throughout the executive branch of government. Reporters who've covered the State Department for years said the Post report was overstating a very normal feature of a transition. The American Foreign Service Association, the AFSA, which is sort of a union for foreign service officers, also stepped into the fray, releasing an unusual public statement that said the entire thing was overblown. January 28th, 2017, CNBC's John Harwood reported that the Justice Department had had no input at all on Trump's now infamous immigration executive order, aka the travel ban, which was, of course, widely falsely reported as being a ban on all Muslims entering the country. This was the ban that prevented Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen citizens from entering into the US for a 90-day period. That also suspended the admission of all refugees from those countries for 120 days and indefinitely suspended the Syrian refugee program. Incidentally, Chad, North Korea, and Venezuela would be added to that list. Of course, North Korea and Venezuela, not heavily Islamic countries. Chad's Islamic demographic at about 52% approximately. I think the other bulk of that 50% was made up by predominantly Christian offshoots, but whatever. The point here of this story by John Harwood was to portray Donald Trump not just as a deranged racist, but someone who was completely out of control and would do whatever he wanted outside of the permissions of law, even in government. CNN ended up retracting this report a few days later, or rather contradicting CNBC's report a few days later, because they obtained internal memos that showed that the Department of Justice were not only consulted, but had actually signed off on the move, saying it was illegal, and this is something that would then later, of course, be held up by the Supreme Court. To quote CNN, the executive order was approved last Friday in a less than two-page memorandum by the Office of Legal Counsel, the office within the Justice Department that provides authoritative legal advice to the president and agencies within the executive branch. The memo summarized several key provisions of the executive order, but its legal analysis was very brief. The proposed order is approved with respect to form and legality. January 29th. While the travel ban was great mileage for the press and most major outlets were clamoring for their own version of anonymous sources tell us that Trump is doing it without guidance and advice, the New York Times went with how Trump's rush to enact an immigration ban unleashed global chaos. And in that report, they said General John F. Kelly, the Secretary of Homeland Security, had dialed in from a Coast Guard plane as he headed back to Washington from Miami. Along with other top officials, he needed guidance from the White House, which had not asked his department for a legal review of the order. Halfway into the briefing, someone on the call looked up at the television in his office and said, "The president is signing the executive order that we're discussing," the official said, stunned. Of course, General Kelly would later say in a press conference that this reporting was absolutely false and that everyone in the administration was aware that it was coming, which of course was something that was backed up by the documents that would be obtained by CNN after the fact. January 31st, CNN's Jeff Zeleny reported that the White House had set up Twitter accounts for two judges for Trump's selection of the Supreme Court, and this was done in a way to sort of try and keep them secret. This obviously was kind of presented as, oh, look, Trump only really understands social media and reality TV, not the nuances of so proper and noble US politics. But of course, it would then later go on to transpire that the accounts were not set up by the White House at all. They were later suspended under Twitter's impersonation of a proper person's rules, and Zeleny would go on to retract the story, but just not explain how he got it wrong at all. February 2nd, and Steve Clemens of The Atlantic reported that some Secret Service manager-level personnel were going to be forced to resign tonight and escorted out of the Eisenhower Executive Office building. Two out, but sources say more. He would then follow up by saying one of the fired Secret Service managers speculates Trump is restructuring the whole Secret Service, but this is speculation. He would be contacted directly in public via Twitter by the Secret Service itself, saying, advising your reporting continues to be false, still waiting you to contact us for an official statement. The story would then later go away, and indeed the initial tweet was deleted. Also on the 2nd of February, we get the first piece of Russian hysteria on this list, and that is NBC's Peter Alexander reported, breaking! The U.S. Treasury Department is easing Obama-era sanctions to allow companies to do transactions with Russia's FSB, which of course is the successor organization to the KGB. This was sort of laying that groundwork, laying the foundations that, Donald Trump wants to have better relationships with Russia because he's a Russian plant, he's a Russian agent. Of course, by the time anyone had done any cursory investigations, by the time people had actually started looking into it, it. By the time the report actually was out there and sort of fully tweaked to reflect reality, there was a line included in it which said sources familiar with the sanctions say it's a technical fix that had been planned under the Obama administration to avoid the unintended consequences of cyber sanctions. The initial tweet that intimated that this was some sort of collusion got thousands of retweets. A subsequent correction, obviously less so, which is by design. That is a feature, not a bug. Also, on February 2nd, another big one. The Associated Press reported that Donald Trump was threatening the president of Mexico with an invasion. That was how they interpreted his quote, his now infamous quote about bad hombres. Of course, referring to the drug cartels and organized crime down in Mexico. Numerous publications picked this up, including the Washington Post. The Washington Post would later recant and say that the Associated Press information could not be independently confirmed. I'll just read you what they said initially, and that is President Donald Trump warned in a phone call with his Mexican counterpart that he was ready to send U.S. troops to stop bad hombres down there unless the Mexican military does more to control them. And this was according to an excerpt of a transcript of the phone conversation, which was obtained by the Associated Press. But there's a few problems with this, because it wasn't a transcript. It was actually someone reading out what they said was a transcript, and it was actually sort of paraphrased. CNN got the actual transcript, and when they did their report, they had to say the excerpt of the transcript obtained by CNN differs with the official internal readout of the call that wrongly suggested Trump was contemplating sending troops to the border in some sort of hostile way. February 4th, and it's Josh Rogan of the Washington Post again, and this time it's with one of the most shockingly bad pieces of reporting of the year, which is an incredible accolade in and of itself. The story was called Inside the White House Cabinet Battle Over Trump's Immigration Order. We're back revisiting that again. And it was constantly changed and updated to the point where the original story, there was almost nothing left of it. It's kind of incredible that there's even a relic of it that can be found on the internet. Basically, they had to repeatedly update and correct this story to the point where it got that a conference call hadn't happened, one of the meetings in the stories hadn't actually occurred, and some of the actions that were attributed to Trump were actually done by the chief of staff. You can see these corrections yourself. Prior to the publication of this column, the Post sought comment from the Department of Homeland Security, but not from the White House, and we should have done both. This article's been updated. Then you have the update itself, which says the article has been updated to reflect comments from the White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. The article previously stated that Stephen Bannon had visited Homeland Security Secretary John F. Kelly's office on Jan 28th, but Bannon did not make such a visit. He also said that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Bannon did not participate in a conference call on January 29th. The article also previously stated that President Trump approved a pause in executive orders pending new procedures. According to Spice, it was actually the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, rather than the president, who approved these new procedures, but not a pause. So, just a reminder that Josh Rogan still has a job. He's still employed. He still works for the Washington Post, still works for CNN. He's now written a book about US-China relations, which includes, among other things, his take on the lab leak theory, which I'm sure you bet you really want to go out and read that to get the inside scoop, given how incompetent this guy is. But just also a reminder, these weren't the only stories he blew just about Trump in 2017. He also blew a story about Tulsi Gabbard, and he did that because he literally got the spelling of an organization wrong. He couldn't even do a basic spelling check. This is an award-winning US journalist. That should terrify you. February 14th, and we're back to the New York Times. They reported about supposed contact between the Trump campaign staff and senior Russian intelligence officials. It would later come to pass that Comey, in June, as part of the testimony he had to give to the Senate Intelligence Committee, that the story wasn't true. He said, in the main, it was not true. The challenge, and I'm not picking on reporters about writing stories about classified information, is the people talking about it often don't really know what's going on. And those of us who actually know what's going on are not talking about it. And we don't call the press and say, hey, you got that thing wrong. So, as is now the norm, rather than just acknowledge the mistake and hold an inquiry as to like why it happened and let's make sure it doesn't happen again, they went on to actually write a really long article that, to summarize it, it just says, we're not really sure what he means about right or wrong, but after we did our report, which he said was wrong, other publications reported similar stuff, so we were probably right all along. That was their hot take. Seemingly with the purposes of underlining that Donald Trump would only work with deranged fascists because he himself is a deranged fascist, ProPublica's Raymond Bonner did a report about the CIA official Gina Haspel, which of course was Trump's pick for CIA director, saying she was in charge of a secret CIA prison where the Islamic extremist terrorist suspect Abu Zubaydah had been waterboarded and tortured, and she'd been laughing about the prisoners' suffering, and Trump's name was across all of those lurid headlines. Of course, later on, it took about a year, ProPublica actually retracted the claims and stated that they got it wrong because neither of the assertions were correct. Haspel wasn't in charge of the base until the interrogation of Zubaydah had ended, and therefore she couldn't have done the other things that they had accused her of. Now, February's pretty intense, so let's jump ahead a couple of months and let's get something a bit more fun, a bit more lighthearted, right? May 27th. We have the BBC's James Landale, and the Guardian and a few others as well. They were sort of out there reporting that Donald Trump couldn't be bothered to listen to a translation of a speech by Italy's Prime Minister, that he wouldn't wear his headset because he just doesn't care. He just doesn't care what foreigners think, does he? Because he's a xenophobe and a racist. He doesn't care, look. Well, of course, it would later be corrected that he was wearing a translation earpiece. It was just that he had a very sophisticated one that was so small you couldn't really see it unless you were looking for it. And this would later be picked up by Gizmodo and corrected. Other stories, there was other outlets that corrected this story. But even in the corrections, like this one in Gizmodo, they said, quote, Trump is notorious for being tremendously disrespectful to foreign leaders, which, of course, you can just summarize as, see, even when we're wrong, we know he hates those bloody foreigners, doesn't he? June 4th, NBC News reported in a tweet that Russian President Vladimir Putin had told TV host Megyn Kelly in a now infamous interview that he had compromising information. Remember, we all know about Compromat now and the PP tape and all that bullshit, right? He actually had compromising information about Donald Trump. But what had actually happened was Putin had said the exact opposite. He said, I do not have compromising information on Donald Trump. And NBC News had to issue an immediate correction and delete the tweet. June 6th. It took 4 CNN journalists to fuck this one up. Gloria Borger, Eric Lichtblau, Jake Tapper, legend, and Brian Rokas. They ran a story entitled Comey Expected to Refute Trump. And they said in that story that Comey was going to dispute President Trump's very public claims that Comey had told him to his face that he wasn't under investigation on multiple occasions. Now, naturally, the exact opposite occurred, and so they would have to kind of scramble, repurpose the story. You can see the before and after on your screens. The correction said, this article was published before Comey released his prepared opening statement. The article and headline have been corrected to reflect that Comey does not directly dispute that Trump was told multiple times he was not under investigation in his prepared testimony released after this story was published. And of course, as always, zero consequences for that one. June 7th. This is another one from the Associated Press. They wanted to prove that Trump can't actually read. Another big thing you have to do is Trump's a moron, Trump's a moron. That's another reason he's dangerous, isn't it? He's not just a racist and a lunatic. He's not just someone who will operate outside of law. He's not just someone who wants to fire nuclear bombs into tornadoes or whatever other nonsensical story we're going to make up. He actually just can't read. He's actually illiterate. And so They ran a story that said he had misread the potential cost to a family with insurance under the Affordable Care Act who wanted care from an existing doctor. What's hilarious about this one is, in actuality, it was the Associated Press that had, in their desperation to expose Trump as a functional illiterate, they'd misread the numbers and ended up putting out a false story, for which they would later issue a correction. June 22nd, and this is a big one and a weird one, CNN's Thomas Frank and two other journalists had reported that Congress were investigating a Russian investment fund with ties to Trump officials, and they published it under their, now somewhat looking back, it's hilarious, Trump Watch series. And at the center of the story would be Scaramucci, who has one of the shortest ever, I think he's tied for shortest ever tenures as a White House press secretary. And it was about him and a meeting he held with Kirill Dmitriev, who is a Kremlin ally and head of a sanctioned Russian investment fund. The report said that the Senate Intelligence Committee was investigating the meeting at the behest of two Democratic senators, one of which I think was Elizabeth Warren, and they wanted to know whether it had involved a discussion of economic sanctions that Obama had put in place and the potential raising of those economic sanctions. Now, it was considered a bombshell report. It was put out as such, but the story would be retracted within 24 hours. And by retracted, I mean not edited, not changed. I mean fully retracted. It would disappear. All links to it on CNN would disappear. They would issue a formal apology to Anthony Scaramucci, and the three journalists in charge of it would have to resign. And this was declared to be a huge embarrassment to CNN, although, you know, they've had plenty of those. One of the biggest of all time, according to the Washington Post. And it was really strange. CNN never said that the story was wrong or incorrect. So what was the problem? So first, the story was published without following any internal protocols whatsoever. It was sourced to one anonymous source that then wasn't even run by an editor. One of the rules that they had at CNN, and I guess at most sensible publications, are if you're running stories like this, your senior editor needs to look at the source, vet the source, make sure it's good, look at the original reporting. These journalists just went and blundered and pushed it out. On top of that, it's also got to be said that as big scoops go, it wasn't really one at all, because Scaramucci himself had said, I'd just had this meeting with Kirill Dmitriev, and he talked about it on Bloomberg TV literally the day after it happened. He also had said that any action he took as a result of information ascertained from that meeting would have to be governed by ethics rules around the government. So you add that to the fact that there wasn't any hard evidence that any investigative body had concluded that there was anything wrong with the meeting at all, or that there was any wrongdoing about it. It just seems to be like one of those massive, like, overhyped stories that were peddled without any oversight, and sort of just made the publication look a little bit foolish. But even though the journalists resigned in disgrace, as is the norm whenever journalists get anything wrong or do anything bad, other journalists all pipe up and say, oh, it's a tragedy. The New York Times lamented their punishments and sort of said, oh, God, look at what's happened to this elite level reporting unit that couldn't even conform to basic internal behavioral standards. But then the New York Times themselves would run a report that everyone was saying, oh, look, it vindicates the journalists. And what their report had put out was that there was all these meetings that were being looked at as part of the investigation into alleged Russian collusion, but that was never an issue in the first place. The report reiterated that the meeting had been scrutinized, which we knew. They didn't state that there was anything improper had taken place. There was no new information about that. The existence of the meeting, of course, had never been denied. And even with all of that being said, Business Insider would come out and say, oh, it's a twist. You've got to question CNN's decision to force the resignation of their journalists. It was just a nothing story that was massively overhyped, and the retraction stands and the apology stands, regardless of the new reporting supposedly put out there by the New York Times. Just a nothing burger, dare I say. July 6th, many outlets were just uncritically repeating a claim that was made by Hillary Clinton, where she had said that 17 American intelligence agencies had concluded that Russia orchestrated election attacks to make sure she lost the election, and more importantly, to get their asset, Donald Trump, into the White House. Now, in actuality, it wasn't 17. It was never 17. It was at most 4 intelligence agencies had arrived at that conclusion, and as we've subsequently seen, not that I'll get into it here, some of those intelligence agencies, perhaps not as neutral in the whole matter as you would like to believe, but I don't understand why the media couldn't. Well, I do understand, but I mean, you probably don't understand why the media couldn't come out and just correct and say, well, you know, we probably did over-egg the pudding by saying 17. It's not 17, it's 4. But actually, instead, they ran a bunch of pieces that said 17 or 4. It doesn't really matter, does it? Now, listen, ask yourself, if I've had 4 drinks, right, what kind of hangover I have in the morning, and if I've had 17 drinks, what kind of hangover I'd have in the morning. Turns out 17 and 4, pretty big fucking difference, honestly, but whatever. The New York Times said it was only 4 because the other 13 weren't investigating the matter at all. That was literally their excuse for getting it wrong, and their sort of outline for why it doesn't really matter. PolitiFact even went and out said 17 or 4, it doesn't matter. The conclusion's the same, and it's the conclusion that's important. CNN went with, it doesn't matter whether it's 17 or 4. The big problem is, why won't Donald Trump listen to 4 or 17 or any number of intelligence agencies? And of course, this just obfuscates the crux of the matter, which is, I mean, first point, if you're a journalist and you can't catch the difference between 17 and 4, what the fuck are you doing having a job? But then on top of that, the source of the claim, which was a Democrat Party political figure, she was able to just say it, have it repeated completely uncritically, 4 months, and all this new rigorous fact-checking, all this new adversarial type of journalism that we were supposed to be seeing, she was able to completely bypass it. August 31st, NBC News, Ken Delanian and Carol Lee, they had come out with a story saying, we've obtained some Trump's official notes about a meeting with a Russian lawyer, and the word donation is in it. We've got him this time. We've definitely got him this time. They're talking about donations. However, shortly after the report would come out, they would walk it back. Turns out the word donation didn't actually appear anywhere, they said. But we got it wrong slightly. The word donor is in there, not donation. Now, Politico would pick up the story after that, and they would be like, listen, we've looked at the notes, the word donation and the word donor, neither of them are in there. And in fact, we've picked apart every aspect of the notes of the meeting, and there isn't a single detail that would damage the Trump family or their campaign or tie them to anything untoward. September the 5th, CNN, Chris Cillizza, he wrote some unbelievably fucking cringeworthy piece, which quotes Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. I shit you not. Basically addressing Trump's claim of the campaign being wiretapped. He said it's a flat-out lie, even though he didn't have the means nor the desire to actually fact-check the claim. And I'll give you the cringeworthy quote he included. I'll do it in Jon Snow style. When enough people make false promises, words stop meaning anything, said Jon Snow in the season 7 finale of Game of Thrones. Then there are no more right answers, only better and better lies, and lies won't help us in this fight, McQueen. Now, it would then later, of course, go on to transpire in 2019 that CNN would have to, I'm sure very reluctantly, report that Trump's campaign had indeed been wiretapped. And, quote, the government snooping continued into early this year, including a period when Manafort was known to talk to President Donald Trump. Still to this day, though, you'll find publications that argue about the semantics of it, saying, but it wasn't really a wiretap, and it wasn't in real time, and it wasn't Trump's offices directly, and all of this stuff. His campaign was unquestionably the victims of espionage. November 6th, we'll have some nice pettiness. Little palate cleanser. CNN's Daniel Shane selectively edited a Trump speech to make it look as though Trump didn't understand that Japan builds cars and does so in the United States. The original story is actually preserved on a Fox News website, but I can assure you this was written by Shane over at CNN Money. The quote that he went with to open his article: President Trump wants Japan Incorporated to try, in quotes, building vehicles in the US. Try building your cars in the United States instead of shipping them over. Is that possible to ask? That's not rude. Is that rude? I don't think so. Trump told executives from automakers, including Toyota and Mazda, during a trip to Japan on Monday. Now, what he'd done is he'd left out some very key sentences from the Trump quote, as is the norm in this era. You can't just let the man speak for himself. We must edit and deceive and misquote and repeat the lie repeatedly over and over again to brainwash you people into thinking he said something he didn't, when he's just as equally... But you can just condemn him on his own words, guys. You can do that. You can do that. No, we can't do that. And this is just light-hearted nonsense. So if this type of bullshit they're going to lie about, makes you wonder about the other stuff, or at least it should if you have a critical thought in your head. But the sentences before that quote were: I also want to recognize the business leaders in the room whose confidence in the United States, they've been creating jobs. You have such confidence in the United States, and you've been creating jobs for our country for a long, long time. Several Japanese automobile industry firms have been really doing a great job, and we love it when you build cars. If you're a Japanese firm, we love it. So, of course, he does know that Japan builds cars in the US and there are business relations there. The quote itself was so egregiously butchered in the CNN Money report, even the Washington Post came out and addressed it and said, look, if you cherry pick quotes like that, they're not going to believe us for all the other stuff, he said, while working for a publication that cherry picks quotes and lies. November 6th, of course, was a great day for pettiness because the trip to Japan was ongoing. So it's another example of Donald Trump. He's a fish out of water, isn't he? He hates all foreign culture and he's such a boorish mess. So a CNN journalist called Veronica Rocha, she put out an edited video that made Donald Trump, while he was having a visit to the presidential palace in Japan, made it look like he just couldn't be bothered to feed the fish properly and threw fish food into the pond. And this lie got picked up by Huffington Post contributor Yasha Ali, who has a sizable Twitter account, tweeted it out. Julie Davis of the New York Times and CNN also repeated it. And Jezebel, who I know, look, Jezebel aren't a serious publication, guys. They are a joke by definition. They went with big stupid baby. This is a literal headline. Big stupid baby dumps load of fish food on Japanese koi pond. And when it came out that actually Donald Trump was only following what the Japanese Prime Minister had done, they corrected it and went, many people have pointed out that Abe also dumped his fish food into the pond, but this does not change the fact that Trump's remain a big, extremely stupid baby, though I should have noted he is also racist, sexist, and thoroughly incompetent. So as you can see, the full video obviously shows that he was just following the lead of Japanese Prime Minister. And there was a bunch of begrudging corrections. Gizmodo, again, they picked it up and corrected it. But as always, when these corrections come in, people can't just say we got it wrong. They have to add the caveat, we got it wrong, and there should be some reprisals about that. But actually, you know, really the big problem is anyone talking about that we got it wrong when Donald Trump's getting away with worse things every day. And this is what they went with in their write-up. In the wide world of media mistakes, Koigate is probably somewhere between a spelling error and posting the wrong hyperlink. Of course, it's deceptively editing a video to make Donald Trump appear to be something he isn't. That has serious ramifications, but no, they say it's the same as a typo. That's how bad media is. And then they go on to add, but you can be sure that we'll be talking about Koigate for some time as an example of what's wrong with the media, because nobody is operating in good faith anymore. The year 2017 and beyond is simply a contest to see who can be outraged over the most minute details of any scandal, all while very real scandals are dismantling American democracy. December 2nd. Humiliation for ABC News because Brian Ross reported, big scoop, Trump official, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, he's going to testify that when Donald Trump was a candidate, he directed him to contact, quote, the Russians. So this reporting was seen as so drastically impactful to Donald Trump, his potential to be removed as president, etc. It led to a pretty big downturn in the stock market. I think it closed 41 points under opening. It impacted on people's 401ks and all that stuff. But it was wrong. It was a lie. ABC had to later correct the report, and it turned out that based on the dates, based on the information, Donald Trump had already been elected. He wasn't a candidate when he asked Flynn to contact the Russians. And that contact, by the way, was about the best way to combat ISIS. So this ended up, this was such a black eye for the network. Brian Ross is a tenured journalist. Initially, he got a month unpaid suspension. That was made very public. ABC put out an apology. Then it was also publicly reported that actually, no, Ross will never be allowed to report on Trump again. But it wasn't enough. It was too humiliating. The story was too big. It hurt people financially. So he had to leave the organization. There was no way he could hold on to his network job anymore. But he got a glowing write-up on the way out. Everyone thanked him for all the decades of hard work and contribution to ABC. And he's now got a twice-weekly show on the Law and Crime Network. December 4th, another absolute shocker from the New York Times, where they were so keen to jump the gun with a story that subsequent edits, retractions, rewrites now just make the story completely divorced from what it was originally meant to be about. And that was that they reported that Trump Deputy National Security Advisor Katie McFarland had supposedly contradicted herself and lied about another official's contacts with Russians when she was giving testimony to Congress. Obviously a very serious thing. You can look at a forensic analysis on archiving site NewsDiffs and see the sheer volume of edits that this story went through. But let's just start with the headline. The headline that went out initially was McFarland contradicted herself on Russia contacts, congressional testimony shows. So very factual, very forthright. McFarland did contradict herself on this topic, and the congressional testimony shows it. That was then later edited to email counters aid on Flynn's Russia contact. So now it was, these emails kind of contradict each other. They then decided, no, we're going to go back to the original. So it's back to McFarland contradicted herself on Russia contacts, congressional testimony shows. But then they had to change it again to email counters testimony on Flynn by former aide. And then it became former aide's testimony on Russia is questioned, which is a very soft, almost, climb down from what they were saying originally. And the entire opening of the article would be cut, and the claims that were originally made within it would not be repeated in the subsequent rewrites. The original report said an email sent during the transition by Donald Trump's former Deputy National Security Advisor Katie McFarland appears to contradict the testimony she gave to Congress over the summer about contacts between the Russian ambassador and Mr. Trump's former National Security Advisor Michael T. Flynn. Miss McFarland had told lawmakers that she did not discuss or know anything about interactions between Sergei I. Kislyak, who had been Moscow's ambassador to the United States, and Mr. Flynn, according to Senate documents. But emails obtained by the New York Times appear to undermine those statements in a December 29th message about newly imposed Obama administration sanctions against Russia for its election interference. Ms. McFarland, then serving on Mr. Trump's transition team, told another transition official that Mr. Flynn would be talking to the Russian ambassador that evening. This discrepancy is likely to add to mounting troubles for the White House that stem from Mr. Flynn's interactions with Russian officials. He pleaded guilty on Friday to lying to FBI agents about his discussions with Mr. Kislyak about the sanctions. All gone, all cut, not there anymore. And actually what they went with was, quote, a leading Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee questioned on Monday whether a high-ranking official in Donald J. Trump's transition team had been deceptive over the summer about a knowledge of discussions between Michael T. Flynn. Completely different, complete climb down, another nothing burger on the Russian front. December 4th, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort had worked with a Russian intelligence-connected official. This was it. Now they're working with officials. They're working with Russian officials, Russian government officials, with ties to the intelligence community. This has to be it. They would then, of course, later issue a correction explaining that the individual wasn't an official at all and was just an individual. December 8th. So I want to end on this one because I think It's a personal favourite of mine. There are a couple of others that said this isn't an exhaustive list. But for me, it's right up there with the most staggeringly incompetent story, I think potentially of all time. And it's by CNN. Manu Raju, Jeremy Herb. They reported that Donald Trump Jr. had conspired with WikiLeaks in advance of the publication of those damaging DNC and Clinton campaign emails. So this is it, right? This is a big one. Proof of that is proof that WikiLeaks had ties to Russian agents, were acting on behalf of Russia, and that they were colluding with Trump for Russian interests. It ties it all together, all of the reporting, all of the hysteria. This is it. And CNN said they had the smoking gun, and they got it from an email. There was just one problem. They didn't read the date. They got the date wrong by 10 days. I'll give you... Glenn Greenwald did a write-up of this, so I'll just read what he had to say about it. He can put it more succinctly and eloquently than I can. It was in a piece entitled "The US Media Suffered Its Most Humiliating Debacle in Ages and Now Refuses All Transparency Over What Happened." He did this while he was still at The Intercept. Obviously, he's moved on since then. Quote, "The entire revelation of the CNN story was based on an email that CNN strongly implied it had exclusively obtained and had in its possession. The email was sent by someone named Michael J. Erickson, someone nobody had heard of previously, and whom CNN could not identify, to Donald Trump Jr., offering a decryption key and access to DNC emails that WikiLeaks had uploaded. The email was a smoking gun in CNN's extremely excited mind because it was dated September 4th, and that is crucially 10 days before WikiLeaks began promoting access to those emails online, and thus proved the Trump family was being offered special, unique access to the DNC archive, likely by WikiLeaks and the Kremlin. It's impossible to convey with words what a spectacularly devastating scoop CNN believed it had, so it's necessary to watch it for yourself to see the tone of excitement and breathlessness and gravity the network conveyed, as they clearly believed they were delivering a near-fatal blow on the Trump-Russia collusion story. And at this point, there's an embedded video of CNN's outrageous coverage that they've subsequently removed. Greenwald continues, "There was just one small problem with this story. It was fundamentally false in the most embarrassing way possible. Hours after CNN broadcast its story and then hyped it over and over and over, the Washington Post reported that CNN got the key fact of the story wrong. The email wasn't dated September 4th, as CNN claimed, but September 14th, which means it was sent after WikiLeaks had already published access to the DNC emails online to everyone else in the world. This actually proves, by the way, that WikiLeaks, they gave it to the Trumps after everybody else. The Trumps got it last. Thus, rather than offering some sort of special access to Trump, Michael J. Erickson was simply some random person from the public encouraging the Trump family to look at publicly available DNC emails that WikiLeaks, as everyone by then already knew, had publicly promoted. In other words, the email was the exact opposite of what CNN presented it as being." And so there you have it. That is 1 year of lies and incompetence from the institution that calls itself the Fourth Estate. And trust me, it got worse. They got more frequent. They got bolder. And it's shocking because it's all rooted in this idea that Donald Trump was such a unique danger, a uniquely dangerous candidate. He had to be stopped, and only journalists could do it. And they could only do it through the power of using their platforms to lie to the general populace to bring them on side. There was a kind of unsaid and unspoken idea, and that was that it'll all be okay afterwards. Whatever we have to do to get to a post-Trump world is fair game. It's all going to be okay, and then we can all go back to normal once Donald Trump has gone away. But of course, there is no going back from this. The media is inherently corrupt. It'll continue to lie, and the reasons for it will just differ and probably, if anything, become more and more throwaway and meaningless. And that's what should scare you. Because look, maybe you agree that Donald Trump was a uniquely bad and dangerous candidate. I lived through the George W. Bush years. And so I find that stupefying if anybody thinks that Donald Trump is a worse president than George W. Bush was and committed sort of greater atrocities than he did. We're still feeling the ramifications and fallout from the Bush era. But regardless, that you beat political opponents through the ballot, you beat them through exploring their ideas and policies. You don't do this. You don't take something that is designed to serve the people, that is designed to protect people, and turn it into a sort of twisted, malevolent force that currently is now being hijacked for bad things. And remember, the Fourth Estate is about holding powerful people accountable, but you have to hold them accountable for the things they did, not the things they didn't do. And we're now at a stage, by the way, where even amid increasing claims and clamors from American citizens that they want more oversight for journalists, none of that's coming. We need an estate to protect us from the American media, and even in Europe, and because they have such powerful influence across the board that we're all under the yoke of it to some degree. Now, I'm going to sign off and let all of this kind of percolate in your brain. I hope I've demonstrated that this isn't just common or garden incompetence, because even in the areas where it was incompetence, the incompetence was fed by the desire to lie. They were kind of trying to reverse engineer what they already believed. People believed Trump was a Russian asset, so that's how you end up with comically inept stories that, look, we've got him, they were sent an email. Yeah, do you want to check the date first, mate, before you fucking spray your boxers in excitement? Well, no, they don't. And they know as well that outside of some ribbing on social media, outside of some mockery, what comes around next will just distract everybody. People don't remember. People don't track these things. So it will be bad enough if the media had just universally decided to portray one side of the political aisle, one political candidate, as being uniquely evil, damaging to democracy, compromised in some way, to continually lie about them at every opportunity that they could. But that wasn't just the only factor that was at work. In addition to that, what was also happening was anything that was negative from the other side of the political aisle over at the DNC was being pushed as being something positive, no matter what the reality of it was. And that's what we're going to get into in the next episode of Enemy of the People. I hope to see you there.